Today's case takes us to Canada, to the rural province of Nova Scotia back to April 18th, 2020. At first, it seemed like any other quiet weekend in a small town community. But over the course of 13 terrifying hours, a man named Gabriel Wortman would unleash the deadliest mass shooting in Canadian history, killing 22 people, setting multiple fires, and leaving an entire nation shaken. This is not only the story of one of Canada's darkest days, but of trust betrayed by a man who lived amongst his victims, of systematic failures that allowed the rampage to stretch on for hours, and of how a community's peace was shattered by unimaginable violence. This is the story of Nova Scotia's mass shooting. Hello, and welcome to Crime and Psyche with me, Drea, where together we explore true crime stories and the psychology behind them. Nova Scotia is Canada's second smallest province, but it carries a character all on its own. Its rugged coastlines, fishing villages, and expansive forests create a landscape that feels both remote and deeply communal. The community is affected by the Massacre. Portapique, Wentworth, Glenholm, Shubenacadie, and Enfield were known as quiet, rural places where people felt safe. Neighbors knew one another, and life moved at a slower pace. Violence of this magnitude felt unthinkable here. It was the kind of village where people noticed if you didn't pick up your mail for a few days, and where community events like barbecues, local church gatherings, and volunteer fire hall meetings brought everyone together. Crimes of serious violence were rare in these areas. While mass shootings have been headlines in other parts of the world, in Nova Scotia, it felt almost unthinkable. This very sense of safety made what happened in April 2020 all the more devastating. The massacre did not just break families, it shattered the sense of security that defined rural Nova Scotia. Gabriel Wortman was born in 1968 in New Brunswick and later moved to Nova Scotia. On the surface, he was a successful small-town denturist. He ran a busy practice, owned multiple properties, and cultivated an image of prosperity. At one point, some patients remembered him as skilled, even generous at times, occasionally offering free or discounted care. To some, he was eccentric, but seemed harmless. However, behind his carefully crafted facade was a man with a long, troubling history of violence, manipulation, and exploitation. As early as 2002, Gabriel's violent tendencies were documented in court. He pleaded guilty to assault that year and was sentenced to 9 months of probation. During that time, he was prohibited from possessing weapons and ordered to undergo anger management counseling. But the probation didn't reform him. If anything, it underscored how deeply entrenched his anger and aggression had become. Gabriel also revealed his ruthlessness in civil disputes. In 2004, he quote-unquote offered to help a friend who was on the verge of losing his home to financial trouble. Instead of assisting, Gabriel quietly took ownership of the property, evicted the friend, and sold it. Years later, in 2015, he manipulated another family relationship. When his uncle lent him a home in Portapique temporarily, Gabriel refused to give it back, claiming he was owed money. Eventually, the uncle had to sell, and tragically, one of the eventual buyers would later become one of Gabriel's victims in 2020. These disputes showed a pattern. Wherever Gabriel saw weaknesses, he exploited it. His abuse was not limited to property or personal relationships. As a denturist, Gabriel had professional power over patients, and he abused it.
Advocates are calling for more screening and more accountability when governments provide funding for professionals to provide services, especially when the people receiving those services are already vulnerable.
At least 8 complaints were filed with the Denturist Licensing Board of Nova Scotia between 1998 and 2020. 3 of those came from women who described abusive behavior. 1 reported sexually explicit comments during treatment. Others, particularly women from marginalized backgrounds, never filed official complaints. For Black and Indigenous women, and for those already vulnerable, including sex workers, there was a deep fear that reporting would lead to disbelief, victim blaming, or even punishment against them rather than Gabriel himself. As one community advocate later explained, he openly took advantage of desperate people. No one would believe them.
A lot of times abusers are not stupid. They are smart. They know how to manipulate systems, how to use different tools to control their partners or to control other people in their lives. It's a very calculated, conscious thing.
This systemic failure allowed him to continue unchecked for decades. He deflected every complaint, often claiming the women had mental health issues or were simply trying to ruin his reputation. In 2007, he even signed a settlement agreement with the licensing board and was ordered to undergo counseling, but the underlying behavior never changed. There was also his fascination with firearms. Despite being barred from owning weapons after his assault conviction, Gabriel began building an illegal collection. He inherited one semi-automatic rifle from the estate of a deceased associate named Tom Evans in 2009 and smuggled others across the US-Canada border. By the time of the rampage, investigators recovered multiple weapons linked to him: 2 semi-automatic handguns, 2 semi-automatic rifles, and Constable Heidi's stolen service pistol, which was taken during the massacre itself. His illegal stockpile would become the tools of his destruction. Together, these pieces form a chilling portrait. Gabriel Wortman was not an ordinary man who snapped. He was someone with a long history of predation, exploiting patients, manipulating family, intimidating neighbors, abusing his partner, and hoarding weapons. His violence in April 2020 was not spontaneous. It was the combination of years, even decades of cruelty, power abuse, and unchecked escalation.
It was here on his property that Gabriel Wortman had barrels of lime and acid and talked about different ways of getting rid of a body, one witness told police.
The massacre unfolded over 13 hours, stretching from the evening of April 18th into the late morning of April 19th, 2020. Gabriel Wortman carried out a sustained campaign of terror that moved from one quiet community to another, from Portapique to Wentworth to DeBerth and finally Shubenacadie. To truly understand the scope of this tragedy, we need to walk through those hours step by step. April 18th, 2020, around 10 p.m., it all began at one of Gabriel Wortman's own properties in Portapique, a village of barely 200 people along Nova Scotia's North Shore. That night, an argument erupted between Wortman and his longtime partner, Lisa Banfield. In a sudden explosion of violence, he assaulted her, dragged her from her vehicle, striking her and even handcuffing her before she managed to break free. Barefoot and terrified, Lisa fled into the cold darkness of the woods, hiding there for hours as gunfire echoed and flames lit the sky. Her survival and later testimony would prove crucial, but at the moment, she was simply trying to survive. Within minutes, Gabriel began setting homes ablaze, including his own, transforming the peaceful village into a scene of chaos and horror. Neighbors stepped outside to see what was happening and walked directly into danger. Among the first victims were Greg and Jamie Blair, a couple deeply rooted in their community. Greg ran a successful business and loved the outdoors. Jamie, known affectionately as Chicken, was devoted to her children and her friends. Both of them were killed in their home. Their 2 young sons managed to escape through a window and run for help. Their neighbor, Corey Ellison, stepped outside with his phone to record the fires, trying to help and to understand what was going on. But unfortunately, he never made it back. Corey was shot and killed near Gabriel's property. He was remembered as kind, hardworking, and always there for his family. A few doors away, Lisa McCulley, an elementary school teacher and choir singer, saw the blaze and thought police had arrived. She was a mother of 2, beloved by her students and her kindness and her warmth. But when she stepped outside to help, Gabriel Wortman shot and killed her as well. By now, 911 calls were flooding dispatch. Police would later describe the scene as unimaginable. Between 10:30 and 10:45 p.m., Gabriel continued moving through the neighborhood, attacking house after house. Dawn and Frank Gulinchin, longtime Portapique residents, were also killed in their home. Frank, a retired correctional officer, and Dawn, known for her warmth and loyalty, were remembered as steady, kind, and family oriented, a couple whose lives were bound by love and sadly ended together. Next, he targeted the Bond family, Joy and Peter Bond, remembered for their humor, generosity, and community spirit. They were found together inside their home, victims of an act that shattered the peace they cherished. Not far away, three generations were wiped out in a single home: Aaron Tuck, Jolene Oliver, and their 17-year-old daughter Emily. Friends said they were a devoted family, hard-working parents, and a bright, creative daughter with a promising future. John Zal and Elizabeth Joanne Thomas were both retirees who moved from the US to Nova Scotia seeking tranquility, but they too were also killed in their home. They loved gardening and the outdoors. Neighbors described them as gentle, kind, and always smiling. By the time RCMP officers reached Portapique at 10:45 p.m., multiple homes were in flames. The air was thick with smoke and confusion. Officers found bodies, terrified residents hiding in basements, and unconfirmed reports that the shooter was dressed as a police officer. For hours, the police believed the gunman was still trapped inside the perimeter they had set. In truth, Gabriel had escaped using a dirt road that led him through a nearby blueberry field, unnoticed and unblocked. He was driving a fully equipped replica RCMP cruiser, complete with lights, decals, and a uniform. Inside the village, terrified residents waited in silence as they texted loved ones from the closets and cellars. For many, it felt like the end of the world had come to their doorstep. By April 19, 2020, around 6:30 a.m., Gabriel had driven north to Wentworth, roughly 40 minutes away. At a home on Hunter Road, he murdered Sean McLeod and Alana Jenkins, both correctional officers. They were known for their humor, kindness, and deep love of music, a couple who brought people together wherever they went. When smoke began to rise from their home, Tom Bagley, a 70-year-old retired firefighter and devoted family man, ran over to help. But sadly, he died doing what he had done all of his life, rushing toward danger to help and protect others. Shortly after, while walking for exercise nearby, Lillian Campbell, remembered as kind, peaceful, and devoted to her family, crossed paths with Gabriel Wortman. Her morning walk, part of her daily routine, became her final act of grace in a world unraveling around her. Between 8 and 9 a.m. in Debert, Gabriel Wortman turned his false authority into a weapon. He pulled over drivers in fake traffic stops using his replica cruiser and uniform. Kristen Beaton, a 33-year-old continuing care assistant, was on her way to work. She was also expecting a child. Dedicated and selfless, Kristen had spent the pandemic months caring for the elderly, but was sadly killed inside of her car. Moments later, Heather O'Brien, a nurse and a mother of 6, was also pulled over by Gabriel. Known for her compassion and warmth, Heather was the heart of her family, a woman who cared for everyone she met. Both women trusted the sight of a police uniform, and that trust sadly cost them their lives. As Gabriel continued south, witnesses reported seeing what looked like an RCMP cruiser pulling cars over along the highway. But instead of issuing warnings, he was killing without mercy. The image of a trusted uniform had become a mask for horror. Between 10 and 10:45 a.m. in Shubenacadie, Constable Heidi Stevenson, a 23-year RCMP veteran and mother of 2, spotted Gabriel's vehicle. She rammed his cruiser head-on in an effort to stop him, and a gunfight followed. Heidi was killed in the line of duty. Her final act was one of bravery and selflessness. Friends said she was a devoted mother, a loyal friend, and a light in her community. Nearby, Joey Weber, a 36-year-old father and outdoorsman, stopped to help when he saw the crash. But he too was fatally shot and killed moments later, an act of kindness met with unimaginable violence. He was remembered for his easygoing nature, generosity, and his love for his children. At around 11 a.m., Gabriel arrived at the home of Gina Goulet, a fellow denturist. She had beaten cancer twice, and she loved salsa dancing, fishing, and spending time with her daughter. But in her own home, the place she had fought to make her sanctuary, she lost her life to the man she once called a colleague. He stole her car and continued toward Enfield. At 11:26 a.m., he pulled into the Irving gas station, unaware that the RCMP tactical officers were refueling there. Within minutes, the rampage was over. A brief confrontation ensued, and Gabriel Wortman was shot and killed, ending what would become the deadliest mass shooting in Canadian history.
Back up.
Fortunately, no one else dies before the gunman encounters Hubley and his colleague, Constable Ben McLeod, who both fire through the car's windows.
Pump 6, Enfield being stopped. Suspect is down in his vehicle, multiple shots away.
Within minutes, backup arrives and confirms the gunman is dead.
In just 13 hours, 22 innocent people were taken: mothers, fathers, teachers, healthcare workers, retirees, and first responders. They were the fabric of their communities, the kind of people who built small town Canada through kindness, courage, and connection. The tragedy left not only grief, but questions about police communication, emergency response, and how such horrors could unfold in places once defined by safety and trust. But above all, it left memories of lives well lived and of a province forever changed. One of the most chilling aspects of Gabriel's rampage was his ability to impersonate law enforcement. His replica RCMP cruiser was nearly indistinguishable from the real thing, down to the decals and lights. He wore an authentic RCMP uniform, making the illusion complete. Victims trusted him, pulled over for him, or let him approach their homes, unaware that death followed. His firearms were obtained illegally, smuggled in from the United States. This fact sparked debate in Canada about cross-border gun smuggling and whether existing gun laws were sufficient to prevent tragedies. The combination of illegal weaponry and impersonation turned Gabriel into a predator with unparalleled access. The RCMP's response was heavily criticized. For 13 hours, Gabriel moved between communities, killing at will. Residents were not warned that the killer was impersonating a police officer until it was too late. An emergency alert system could have been used, but it wasn't, instead leaving many people unaware of the true danger. The Mass Casualty Commission later investigated, concluding that delays in communication and a lack of preparedness contributed to the high death toll. The tragedy highlighted systemic weaknesses in rural policing, vast distances, limited resources, and fragmented communication channels. In the days and weeks following the massacre, Nova Scotia became a province draped in mourning. Communities that once felt safe and quiet were left with empty homes, broken families, and grief that seemed impossible to measure. Across the province, blue lights appeared in windows, a grassroots symbol of remembrance for the 22 lives lost. Vigils were held in Portapique, Halifax, and beyond. At these gatherings, family members spoke through tears about their loved ones, parents, teachers, nurses, retirees, and children whose futures had been taken away. Each eulogy became both an act of mourning and a demand that such a tragedy never happen again. On April 19, 2020, Canada's then Prime Minister addressed the nation. His words captured the shock and sorrow that rippled across the country. The investigation that followed revealed disturbing truths. Despite being prohibited from owning firearms since his 2002 assault conviction, Gabriel had amassed a small arsenal. One rifle came from the estate of a deceased acquaintance, Tom Evans, but most of his weapons were smuggled illegally across the US-Canada border. When police recovered his car in Enfield at the end of the rampage, they found 5 firearms inside. The chief superintendent later confirmed that Gabriel Wortman had no firearms license and explained how his collection had been pieced together illegally over years. This revelation ignited national debate. How could someone with a criminal record, a history of violence, and no license acquire such lethal weapons? Families of the victims demanded answers, insisting that loopholes in gun laws had contributed to the scale of the massacre. Weeks later, the Prime Minister announced sweeping new gun control measures, including a nationwide ban on assault-style weapons, prohibiting their sale, purchase, or use in Canada. The legislation also promised buyback programs and stricter border enforcement. For many Canadians, these measures were long overdue. For others, they felt far too late. The Mass Casualty Commission, formed to investigate the tragedy, also revealed how regulatory boards and authorities dismissed repeated warnings about Gabriel Wortman's conduct. Red flags, if taken seriously, might have prevented the massacre. For many advocates, the massacre was not just about one man's violence, but about the cracks in institutions that failed to stop him. For the families, however, policy changes and official reports could not fill the void. They continued to live with empty chairs at dinner tables and with birthdays and anniversaries marked by absence. While the nation debated laws and institutions, they carried the private weight of grief. As one victim's relative put it, "We want change, yes, but no law will bring them back." The scars of April 2020 will remain forever, etched into the lives of the survivors, into the communities of Nova Scotia, and into Canada's understanding of just how fragile safety can be. In the aftermath, investigators and public were left with agonizing questions. Why did this happen? What could have driven one man to unleash such destruction on neighbors, strangers, and even people who stopped to help? But unfortunately, there was no single motive. Investigators noted Gabriel left behind no manifesto, no letter, no political statement. His actions were not tied to any ideology or organized movements. Instead, what emerged from testimony and evidence was a picture of a man consumed by personal rage, abusive patterns, and a desire for control. The Mass Casualty Commission put it plainly: this was not random. It was the culmination of years of violence, controlled, and unchecked behavior. The story began with an act of domestic violence, his brutal assault on his common-law partner Lisa Banfield. But thankfully, Lisa survived. She escaped barefoot into the woods and hid for hours, badly injured but alive. Her survival was not only a moment of human resilience, it also became a cornerstone of the investigation. When police found her the next morning, Lisa gave testimony that explained much of what otherwise would have remained a mystery. Gabriel's obsession with police gear, the lengths he went to build a replica RCMP cruiser, and the long history of coercion and abuse she had endured in their relationship. Though Gabriel Wortman never faced sentencing, the Commission's inquiry became kind of a judgment, not just of him, but of the gaps in policing, firearm control, and social systems that failed to stop him. But let's take a look at this from the psychological view, because Gabriel Wortman's rampage fits into a chillingly familiar framework that criminologists and psychologists have observed in other mass killers, which is a long period of smaller-scale violence and coercion, escalating until it explodes into large-scale devastation. His crimes were not sudden. They were the culmination of decades of warning signs. One of the most significant markers in his history was domestic abuse. Experts in criminal psychology often describe intimate partner violence as the training ground for larger scales of violence. In these private settings, abusers learn to dominate, intimidate, and strip away another person's autonomy. Gabriel's common law partner described years of being controlled, threatened, and physically assaulted. In many mass shootings, this same pattern is evident. Domestic abuse precedes public violence. Gabriel also demonstrated traits associated with narcissistic personality structures and antisocial tendencies. He presented himself to his neighbors and patients as successful, charming, and financially comfortable. He drove expensive vehicles, owned multiple properties, and curated an image of respectability. But beneath that surface was paranoia, volatility, and cruelty. This duality, the polished exterior hiding a corrosive interior, is characteristic of offenders who thrive on deception. Experts often argue that when such individuals feel their image or authority slipping, they lash out violently. Perhaps the most revealing thread in Wortman's psychology was his fixation on power and control, whether in property disputes where he manipulated family and friends into losing their homes, in his dental practice where women reported abuse and harassment, or in his personal relationships where he dictated and punished behavior. Gabriel consistently sought to place himself above others. He exploited vulnerability wherever he found it. This was not just opportunism, it was predatory behavior. The symbolism of his actions during the massacre drives his point home even further. By impersonating the RCMP, Gabriel didn't just gain tactical advantage, he enacted a psychological fantasy. The police uniform is one of the most trusted symbols of safety in Canadian society. By wearing it, he inverted that trust, transforming protector into predator. Forensic psychologists would describe this as an act of symbolic domination, forcing victims to willingly approach him under the illusion of safety, only to be met with violence. It reflects contempt for authority, but also a perverse thrill in weaponizing society's deepest trust. In criminology, this progression is called escalation. The smaller abuses, harassment of patients, domestic violence, intimidation of neighbors, and manipulation of family were not anomalies. They were stepping stones. Left unchecked, they expanded into stalking, illegal weapons acquisition, and finally, the mass killings of April 2020. Researchers in violence prevention stress that past behavior is the best predictor of future violence, and Gabriel exemplified this truth. The signs were visible, the risk was predictable, but the intervention never came. Ultimately, Gabriel's psychological portrait is not that of a man who snapped, but of a man who rehearsed cruelty, refined domination, and escalated violence until he carried it out on a massive scale. His life illustrates how unchecked patterns of abuse, especially domestic and sexual exploitation, can metastasize into public tragedy. The 2020 Nova Scotia mass shooting remains the deadliest in Canadian history. It was a tragedy that shattered communities, exposed systemic flaws, and left families grieving. It also served as a stark reminder of how violence can emerge from familiar places and from people who seem to have ordinary lives. Gabriel will always be remembered for the destruction that he caused, but it is the victims whose names and legacies deserve to live on. So, that was today's case. If this story struck you as deeply as it did me, please share your thoughts and reflections in the comment section below. And don't forget to subscribe and join me for the next deep dive into the criminal mind. See you then. Bye.